today's World Insight with Tian Wei. Iran to restart uranium enrichment. Is Tehran playing hardball to revive the Iran nuclear deal? And the British Parliament passes a bill barring a no-deal Brexit. How will Boris Johnson overcome the latest hurdle to leaving the EU? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. There are a lot of stories covered today, but first let's go to Hong Kong. Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie Lam has reiterated her 4-point proposed actions and stressed the withdrawal of the controversial so-called Fugitive bill. The 4-point action was announced by Carrie Lam on Wednesday. Besides the withdrawal of the bill, she also appointed new members to a body handling complaints against the police and also promised direct dialogue with communities and initiated a review by academics to examine Hong Kong's social problems. This is what she had to say to journalists today.
To answer your question about whether my announcement on actions yesterday were too little, too late, I suggest, and I hope very much, that this will be looked at in context. I have announced a package of 4 actions. So each of those actions requires a process of deliberation, and taken together, I hope that they would provide a basis for a dialogue and help Hong Kong to break the current impasse.
For the latest of the development in Hong Kong, we have in Hong Kong Lawrence Ma, barrister and chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. Mr. Ma, welcome to our program. First question for you. What do you make of the 4 points made by the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam? Will that be able to calm down the situation from your perspective?
Yes, firstly, very importantly, is the withdrawal of the Fugitive Amendment Bill. The calling for the fully withdrawal of the Fugitive Amendment Bill has been the top request out of the 5 requests of the protesters. And this is the first request of a total withdrawal of the bill. And if the government has now not just backed off from the bill, but a total withdrawal from the bill and never mentioned again, would give the protesters no further reasons to continue their riots and protests. So this is a very important gesture from the government, because the protesters would have no further excuse to go on and take on the street and continue to demolish Hong Kong.
Right. Mr. Ma, as you may know, the 4 points proposed by Mr. Lam will take a while to be realized. Of course, she doesn't give any time frame, because a lot of these things you would never know as to how long it would take for eventual a good result. So what do you make of the process to come and the process to communications to come? Will that be also turbulent time, or we're likely to see some calming down situation for weeks, at least from now on?
Well, the important point is for people not in Hong Kong, that those who are foreign to Hong Kong and the international community to see, is that Ms. Carrie Lam has been a bureaucrat for her professional career in the Hong Kong government. She had been the director of social welfare for many years before elevated to the position of the Minister of Development. She has not handled many political turmoils, particularly with foreign influences. So this is really the first time in her political career to handle these sort of things. During these 2 months, Hong Kong people do understand that she has disappeared from the front, from the public scene, because she was taken back by these protesters. She was horrified, I can say. But today you can see the positive step of a real chief executive coming out to Hong Kong and facing the Hong Kong public and the international community to propose something productive, positive, constructive, so as to take Hong Kong out from the impasse, as she said. So we have great hope on her because we want to see a revitalized, a confident, as well as a re-energized chief executive to lead Hong Kong.
We'll see how things will be evolving from here. Last question for you, Mr. Ma. Now, there is a difference between those who made one round after another of riots in the streets and the general good-hearted, protesters at the very beginning, particularly of this campaign we have seen over the past few months. Those who have been destroying public property, those who have been, quote-unquote, using forces against the police. How do you think Hong Kong, within the legal framework of the territory, will be able to handle those two very different issues?
Of course. There is a very established and mature legal system in Hong Kong, and the chief executive herself has not backed down from the protesters' request not to prosecute them, because one of the 5 requests was not to prosecute these protesters. And the government has been quite stern, and correctly to be so stern, in not conceding to those demands. And those people have been arrested. And there are existing laws in criminal laws and existing offenses to prosecute them. I think the offenders have to be segregated from the general protesters who did not who was protesting peacefully.
Right.
And these protesters who were rioters and vagrants would be severely punished under the laws of Hong Kong.
All right. Lawrence Ma, thank you so much for joining us. Lawrence Ma, who is a barrister and chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. Really appreciate it, sir. That was an update on Hong Kong. We'll shift our focus to Iran after this short break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, the program coming to you live from Beijing. Let's turn to the Iran nuclear issue. Tehran is taking another step in suspending its commitments under the 2015 nuclear deal. President Hassan Rouhani said Iran will start developing centrifuges for enriching uranium as early as Friday. Tehran and Washington have been at the loggerheads since Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal, but Iran has placed the onus of saving the pact on the European powers. Before we get down to the discussion about what exactly is the nature of the latest development, take a look at this first.
Iran has made a new announcement, the third phase of reducing commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Because we have not achieved our desired objective, we will take the third step from the day after tomorrow.
President Rouhani said his country is ready to restart a critical aspect of its uranium enrichment program.
I announce a third step now. Our Atomic Energy Organization is obliged to immediately start doing whatever is technically required for the country in terms of research and development, and to abandon all commitments in terms of research and development under the JCPOA.
The 2015 nuclear deal lifted economic sanctions in exchange for Iran agreeing to circumscribe its nuclear activities. But the U.S. quit the deal last year and reimposed sanctions. Till now, the Trump administration has not only refused to ease economic sanctions on Iran, but also imposed fresh ones targeting the country's shipping network. And Iran has been suspending some of its commitments under the nuclear deal. However, the other parties of the nuclear deal diverged from the U.S. viewpoint. European countries, including France, have been trying to push Iran to comply with the deal, offering proposals such as a $15 billion credit line for Iran. Tehran has also given them 2 more months to try to save the multilateral pact. How can the dead multilateral nuclear deal be brought back to life?
For more on the Iranian nuclear issue, the latest development in Tehran, we are joined by Professor Mohammad Marandi. He's a professor at Tehran University. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., we would like to welcome Mr. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow with the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, Director of Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. In London, Sahil Shah, Policy Fellow at the European Leadership Network. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Professor Marandi, if you can briefly help us to understand, what do you think is the real nature of the latest development decision made by Tehran, going back to centrifuges enrichment?
Well, it's been almost a year and a half now that since the United States has left the nuclear agreement, and since it's been trying to force other countries from implementing the deal. So the Americans under Trump have been bullying the Europeans, the Japanese. They've been attempting to bully the Chinese and other countries into stop doing trade with Iran. That's the maximum pressure campaign. It's economic warfare against ordinary Iranians, and what our foreign minister calls economic terrorism. They're trying to maximize suffering in Iran so that Iran bows down to Trump. But the Iranians so far, for well over a year, they've showed patience. They stayed within the deal, even though the Europeans were not abiding by it, and they tried to push the Europeans towards implementation.
I see.
After over a year, the Iranians began to recognize that the Europeans weren't going to budge, so they began reducing their commitments bit by bit in order to put pressure on the Europeans to start implementation. The Iranians are saying that enough is enough. If this continues, we cannot be the only side that abides by our commitments. We'll have to ultimately leave the deal like the Americans.
Mr. Shah, is this mainly targeting at the Europeans? How do you think the Europeans might react for the near future? So will the deal totally collapse as a result of all of this? Mr. Shah.
I don't think that the deal will fully collapse due to this recent cut that Iran has made to their JCPOA compliance, because I think that Europeans will read this as not significantly affecting Iran's breakout capacity. And I think Europeans, the consensus is that Iran isn't looking to get a nuclear weapon, but is simply trying to build leverage in the face of Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign that Europeans don't agree with, fundamentally disagree with, actually. So I think that the JCPOA, to the extent at which it can be sustained at present, hasn't necessarily changed dramatically because of what Iran has recently announced. I think Iran, every 60 days, they have said that they are going to announce a new cut, and I think this is just part of that and doesn't pose a short-term proliferation risk.
I see. Mr. O'Hanlon, so the maximum pressure so-called approach made by the Trump administration, a total success or a total failure given what's happening right now, the decision made by Tehran right now?
Oh, it's really far too soon to know, because tactically there is some success, if you will, in the sense that whatever the European governments may be willing to do to sustain the deal, European companies are not in a good position to do business with Iran because, of course, they've been given an ultimatum by Washington. Either you do business with Iran or you do business with the United States, not both. And therefore, the maximum pressure campaign is successfully applying a lot of pressure. So that we can, I think, probably all three of us agree to. But the question of what happens next in terms of does Iran sort of partially cry uncle and renegotiate a different agreement? Does Iran become much less active in the broader Middle East, hoping that maybe a Democratic president in 2021 would consider that an adequate measure to then allow for the U.S. to come back into the nuclear deal? These are all questions that I don't know how to answer. So, yes, there is pressure being applied, but no, it's way too soon to talk about success because we don't really know where this is headed.
Yeah, we don't know because also there are a lot of questions within the U.S. that needs to be answered as well in terms of politics and the changes going on over there. In pulling out of the nuclear deal last year, the United States vows to halt Iran's oil exports to pressure Tehran into renegotiating the deal struck with Barack Obama. At least that was the rhetoric coming out of Washington. Tehran is unlikely to settle for any deal that does not allow it to export a minimum 700,000 barrels a day. Current sales have fallen to 300,000 a day. So what's really behind this so-called maximum pressure campaign from Iranians' perspective? Professor Marandi, do you think these are all tactics, including Iran and Washington's, and what's to come?
Well, first of all, Iran's oil exports are higher than 300,000 barrels a day. They have increased over the last couple of months. But I think the objective of the United States, as I said earlier, is to make Iran surrender. And I think it's actually done the opposite. Because while the United States has been able to inflict harm on ordinary Iranians, some Iranians have died due to a lack of a certain medicine for cancer patients or for people who had kidney transplants and that sort of thing. But in general, what it has done is that it has created a very hostile environment towards the United States among ordinary Iranians that I haven't seen since the 1980s. Trump is universally disliked. The United States is viewed very negatively. And what Iran has done is that it's pushed back. So instead of the Iranians, let's say, pulling back in the region, we see that Iran's adversaries are pulling back. The Emiratis, who were trying to help the United States with their maximum pressure, they've raised the white flag. Yeah. And the Saudis and the Emiratis are now at each other's throats in Yemen. Their campaign in Yemen has collapsed. So the Iran's allies in Yemen have won. The same is true in Syria. The extremists that the Saudis and others have been supporting, they are failing. And in Lebanon, the Israelis provoked a conflict, and Hezbollah responded. And so what I'm saying is that basically the Americans, in my opinion, while they've inflicted suffering, but they've created a great deal of hostility and determination.
Okay. That's what the sentiment, as Professor Morandi illustrated, within Iran. But there's another question, Mr. O'Hanlon. What exactly is the goal of the so-called maximum pressure campaign? Now, rhetorically, Washington, particularly this administration, argue with maximum pressure, Iran going to be able to move forward with more compromises. But some also ask the question genuinely whether the action is exactly the purpose of the action itself, meaning that it is about trumping down further the deal and give Iran further pressure and sanctions and isolated Iran even further without really thinking about the next step. So particularly when you have quite ideological approaches within the administration when it comes to foreign policy. So Mr. O'Hanlon, you've been working on the research of Iranian issue for a long time. Whether the action now is exactly the result that some want to see.
Well, I think, the United States is not that subtle about this with the Trump administration's view. They really want a major change in the nature of the Iranian state, certainly its foreign policy across the board, perhaps even its domestic policy at home. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech last spring in 2018 at the Heritage Foundation was very clear. It had a 12-point plan of demands on Iran. I would categorize probably most of those into four main buckets. One is even tighter restrictions or complete elimination of nuclear technology in Iran. A second would be compliance with UN Security Council resolutions on things like Iranian ballistic missile testing, things that are not in the nuclear deal and therefore that Iran has not agreed to, but nonetheless that we would like to see Iran stop. Third is certainly the kind of regional adventurism that my colleague was referring to just a moment ago. He was giving a little bit of an interpretation of how Iran might see it. I might give a little different interpretation and see Iran as more the aggressor. But nonetheless, the overall point is Iran's role in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Hamas, Hezbollah, Yemen, over to even Bahrain. And then finally, Iran's behavior at home and the way in which it creates a domestic apparatus that can really restrict democracy within its own country. Pompeo really wanted changes on all those areas. And if he got them, I think he'd be happy to do a deal with Iran. But it's probably not realistic.
That's exactly my question. If Mr. O'Hanlon, briefly, you can answer us. I mean, why would an unreasonable demand, unlikely to be achieved, the goals be outlined over there as the ultimate goals for a foundation of relationship with Iran? Is this a part of the action that actually really rules out any potential having a relationship with Iran? Mr. O'Hanlon, very briefly from you, sir.
Well, Yeah, I'll be brief. I didn't say it was unreasonable. I said it was unrealistic. It's not unreasonable to ask a country to stop terrorism. It's not unreasonable to ask a country to stop stoking extremism throughout a whole region. And so I don't think that Secretary Pompeo is unreasonable. I just think that it's unrealistic to expect all those things in any kind of a deal.
All right. Certainly, we have very different perspective from different guests about the issue, of course. Let's go to Mr. Shah. So will the Europeans more realistic or more reasonable, whichever word is closer to the logic going on among the European capitals?
I think that the Europeans are absolutely more reasonable than the current U.S. approach, because I think that this maximum pressure campaign, in terms of rating it on a 1 to 10 for success, while yes, there has been economic damage created in Iran in many different sectors and areas that will have a multiplier effect for a while, even if sanctions are then suddenly lifted. The fact of the matter is that in other areas, it's actually had a complete backlash. So we've already had some of the guests talk about the regional behavior, but now there's obviously maritime insecurity. And let's not forget that the reason why Iran is making these nuclear maneuvers is because of the fact that the U.S. is engaging in a maximum pressure campaign that is unnecessarily harming their public, after Iran waited a year's patience and continued to abide by the deal, during which Europeans, the Chinese and Russians couldn't really make up for the economic loss. So Europeans are definitely more level-headed on the issues that they see also being a threat. So, you know, the nuclear issue, the ballistic missile issue, also the regional behavior, as well as one thing that hasn't been mentioned, but the arbitrary detention of, say, Americans or dual nationals. You know, these are all shared issues that America and Europeans see as problems, but they have different tactics that they believe will be able to address them. Europe is much more for diplomacy.
I see, Mr. Shah, but many wonder if you can also briefly, will the Iranian nuclear issue be one division between Washington and the European capitals? Will they ultimately be an important issue to illustrate the differences of approach and belief in foreign policy, or this is very much likely to be the same result that we have seen many other issues, that eventually the Europeans gonna go with the American way, reluctantly or willingly? Many ask.
No, I think that this has now become an emblem of European strategic autonomy or independence from U.S.-led initiatives or U.S.-commanded initiatives. I think that on both the economic and security side, this is an inflection point in European thinking. I think policymakers for the first time are now looking at this and saying, wow, we really need to actually take our own economic and security matters into our own hands, and we cannot always be reliant on U.S. leadership. So I think history will tell to what extent it's an inflection point, but it absolutely will be seen as one for many years to come.
Okay, gentlemen, we only have about 2 minutes left for this round of discussion. Before we go, do you think things are likely to go worse, meaning different sides will put pressure onto each other in order to avoid further damage of their own interests as they see it, or things are likely to clear up a bit after so-called maximum pressure and maximum reactions? Professor Morandi, very briefly, 30 seconds for every one of you.
I think it will probably get worse before it gets better. The United States is arresting Iranians in the United States. One of my colleagues has been arrested for almost a year now on trumped-up charges. We see that Iranian ships are being targeted. We see that bribes are being offered to captains of ships taking Iranian cargo officially by the United States. So the feeling in Tehran is that the United States wants to push this, but the Iranians don't want an escalation. But if there is an escalation, the Iranians will push back and push back very hard.
All right, Mr. O'Hanlon, 30 seconds, please, sir.
Well, I disagree with some of my colleagues' overall assessment, but I think I agree with him things are likely to get somewhat worse before they get better because of the strategies of the two sides. But I don't think they'll get a lot worse, because I don't think Iran wants to paint itself as the villain. I think it would like to stay with some international sympathy and hope that a Democrat wins the White House next fall. So I think Iran will increase the temperature of this crisis a little bit. The United States will continue to apply economic pressure. Things will get a little bit worse, probably not a lot worse in the next 12 months.
Mr. Shah, also finally, 30 seconds.
Absolutely. I think that Iran will remain principled and will want to maintain the high ground on this issue by being committed to multilateralism and diplomacy and trying to work as much as they can with the remaining parties to the deal, as well as other traditional trading partners, to try to alleviate the stress on the Iranian economy. But I think that, you know, as we saw with all the tanker incidents, there's a lot of room for miscommunication or miscalculation, and after that, things could very easily spiral out of control. So I think that it's not necessarily just about the two opposing strategies of maximum pressure and now what the retaliatory actions are going to be, but also about what could happen in the margins and how that could also suddenly make this a lot more damaging and risky.
Okay. Sahil Shah, Mohammad Marandi, last but not least, Michael O'Hanlon. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us and sharing your perspective. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on the program. The British Parliament passed a bill barring a no-deal Brexit. How will Boris Johnson overcome the latest hurdle to leave the EU? Can he really do that? After this break. Welcome back. The program is coming to you live from Beijing, and this is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We turn to the UK, where Brexit is still up in the air. A new showdown is looming between UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Parliament. The rapidly unfolding Brexit drama took another turn when Parliament announced today they would debate and vote on a snap election again on Monday. Elsewhere, Boris Johnson's brother resigned as a member of the Parliament, saying he was torn between family loyalty and national interests. As Brexit hurtles towards a new climax with plenty of twists and turns, the question compounding the country and the world is who holds more power over Britain and Brexit? Before we get down to the discussion about that answer, take a look at this first.
Between Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his own lawmakers, British Parliament saw a pitched battle this week.
Have you lost control, Prime Minister?
6 weeks after taking office on Wednesday, Johnson lost his governing majority in the House of Commons as MPs voted to derail his Brexit plan, tying Johnson's hands with a law that could take the no-deal Brexit off the table.
The ayes to the right, 327. The noes to the left, 299. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlocked.
The approved bill seeks to avert a no-deal Brexit on October 31st. If passed in full by the House of Lords, it could force Johnson to delay Brexit for another 3 months. Despite losing parliamentary majority and being torpedoed by an internal party rebellion, Johnson stuck to his Brexit mantra.
Is that everyone can see that this government is utterly determined to leave the EU on October the 31st, come what may, without a deal, if necessary.
Yet in another twist in the torturous Brexit battle, the Prime Minister suffered double defeat over his plan for a snap general election on October 15th. The opposition Labour Party refused to vote for the election until the law blocking no deal was implemented.
Let this bill pass and gain royal assent, then we will back an election so we do not crash out with a no-deal exit from the European Union.
The battle lines are drawn. The government and the Parliament are fighting for the right to determine Britain's Brexit future. But who'll win and what happens then remains a mystery. With less than 2 months until the deadline for the UK to leave the EU, are we approaching a Brexit finale or just another cliffhanger?
A finale or a cliffhanger? I guess the answer is very obvious. There's a long way to go, but for now, let's go into the latest round of discussion on Brexit. In London, Ian Bagg, a professor at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Brussels, we have Larissa Brunner, policy analyst at the European Policy Center. Last but not least, in Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian from the Department of European Studies, China Institute of International Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start with humor because we do not have a lot of things to enjoy at this moment when it comes to the process of Brexit. But let me go to you, Professor Bagg. You're always one more optimistic than I am. Tell me about why is it important October the 1st, before or after a snap election? Why does it matter that much?
Well, I think it's October 31st rather than the 1st.
October 31st, that's right, sir.
What Boris Johnson has done is he's ordered what's called the prorogation or suspension of Parliament so as to introduce a new session. And that's compressed the time now. As we know over the last couple of days, what the parliamentarians have done is to put forward this new law which will make an obligation on Boris Johnson to go back to the European Union to seek a further extension of the withdrawal timetable if he has not been able to secure a deal with the European Union, as most people seem to expect. This ties his hands, and it means that his promise of Brexit on the 31st of October, in his words, do or die, cannot be fulfilled. And also, with several of his own members of Parliament having been expelled for voting with the opposition on this new bill, he is now only a minority in the House of Commons. So it's a very febrile and difficult to read position at the moment. I think what happens next is that we're expecting the law to be finalised in the House of Lords tomorrow. Then Johnson will attempt again to get a general election called. The opposition doesn't want to leave him free to do it on his terms, so that's the nub of the debate at the moment.
Is the strength, Mr. Cui, observing from afar, of Mr. Johnson as Prime Minister ever strengthened or ever weakened? Earlier we have saw him trying to suspend the Parliament for a few weeks. Obviously he succeeded to a certain extent, but what about the latest twist?
Yes, I think now the big problem for Mr. Johnson and his government is perhaps maybe it will copy the drama of his predecessor, Prime Minister May, because as we know, the end of the Prime Minister May is he could not get out from any gaming with Parliament. But now, of course, I think the big issue or big question for Mr. Johnson is different from his predecessor is because he has this do or die strategy. So now there will be some very pressing, timing challenging, and also now if he could not, provide a more available, I think the deal, I think there will be a very, very big problem for his tenure as maybe a shortest. As the Prime Minister with the shortest term.
Well, we've seen a lot of changes in British politics. There's a lot to catch up with. Ms. Brunner, I'm sure you've been doing much better work than I do, trying to catch up with all the latest from Brussels, what's going on inside the UK. So from Brussels' perspective, now who is having an upper hand, the parliamentarians or the Prime Minister in terms of the fate of Brexit and the nature of Brexit?
Well, from Brussels' perspective, it certainly looks like the UK Parliament has won this particular battle in preventing a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. But ultimately, all those twists and turns don't really address the very fundamental question, which is that there are only very fundamentally, there are only three possible outcomes of the whole Brexit process. There can be a deal, no deal, or the UK government can revoke Article 50 and stop the entire process altogether. And all this turmoil at the moment, I think it's really just delaying the point at which a decision has to be made.
But Professor Bagg, probably some would argue inside the UK, that's exactly the point. The delaying is another way out, probably. Kicking the can down the road, obviously the road could be forever long.
Yes, and that's what Boris Johnson sought to correct. His entire strategy since being appointed Prime Minister, not even elected, appointed Prime Minister, has been to stop the can being kicked further down the road. The trouble is that his approach alienates one group just at the same time as it pleases another. So if he keeps his right-wing pro-Brexit members on side, he loses those who he had to kick out of the party this week. He can't win in this context. And this means that some rather different approach is going ultimately to have to be found. It could be a national government, or it could be the hope that a general election will yield a majority for one party or another. But I think that's unlikely. And in the end, it may have to go to a further referendum. All of these are possible ways of solving the problem before you even get onto the solution that you think is the best one.
Professor Beck, do you think at this moment so-called the public opinion still matters or not? It's mainly the infighting of the politicians first, at least for now.
Yes, the public opinion matters very much for a straightforward reason. What Boris Johnson and his government is seeking to do is to portray the EU side as being intransigent and therefore one enemy, and the parliamentarians as being difficult, making his job far harder, and being another enemy. And his appeal will be to say to the people, look, these two sides are trying to stop me. I want you to support me so I can sort it out. And naturally, the other side says exactly the opposite. So this is the lines of the contest that is now going on.
Ms. Brunner, from the European perspective, I mean the Brussels perspective, do you like to be the so-called one of the two enemies?
I mean, I think it's a very thankless role, but of course there's the big question of how justified it is. I think the EU has made more concessions to the UK than is generally acknowledged in the UK debate. The big one would be the backstop for the Irish border, because initially the EU wanted a Northern Ireland only backstop, but at the request of the UK government, the EU basically made the concession to expand the backstop to cover all of the UK. So the EU has made quite significant concessions. So I'm not sure you can really portray the EU as the bad guy, but at the same time, the EU has to defend its own interests, and I think that you can't really blame someone for doing that in a negotiation.
If I could just ask further, Ms. Brunner, what do you think will be the best strategy for Brussels right now? To wait until the cats fight against themselves inside London among those politicians so that EU could profit from whatever the result, or be more in a way participative in whichever way that the EU feels comfortable when it comes to political choices now London is likely to have?
Well, the strategy of the EU so far has been to really stay out of any UK domestic political debates, and I think that has probably been quite wise, and I think that's probably also the best strategy going forward, because ultimately the aim of the EU is to ensure an orderly withdrawal. So in an ideal scenario, the EU would like the withdrawal agreement to be approved, and so there had to be an orderly withdrawal, and it doesn't want to drag this process out indefinitely. And I think because of the way the EU has been presented so far in the UK by the Leave campaign by the Conservative Party, I think the EU has very little to gain in a way, because Brexit in the UK has become such an ideological question, so I'm not sure to what extent the EU could impact the debate positively.
Mr. Cui, you know, people around the world, we are exhausted following up with all the twists and turns, but, you know, we really need to know what's going on right here in order to figure out the real nature of things for China, for example, and others who are doing business with the UK, who are looking at the UK still as an important international player at the United Nations, for example. The UK still has a very important position there. So how should we look at the ever-ongoing process?
Firstly, I think we should not take a side between the European Union and the UK.
I don't think China is taking sides, or rather
try to keep a neutral position. But another question is, I think for both sides, the lack of mutual trust and the lack of a kind of a spirit of the reconciliation. But I think it's very, very necessary for this Brexit.
I see.
But of course now, I think now for the China and some other member of the international community, we will share the same feeling or suffering with some more average British people, that it should have a stop, it should have a result. Otherwise, we will suffer a lot from the uncertainties.
Okay, well, besides talking about long term, everybody's looking at the short term. Snap election or not? Before we go, 20 seconds for every one of you. Let's see whose prediction will eventually work. Professor Begg, let's go to you.
There will be an election, probably after the 31st of October, and the whole debate now is on whose terms that election is called. Boris Johnson wants it early. The Labour Party can see the elephant trap that he's set for them and doesn't want to fall into it, so they want it later. But everybody wants ultimately to have an election.
Ms. Brunner, briefly.
I agree with Professor Beck. I think an early election after October 31st is the most likely outcome.
Mr. Cui?
Certainly there will be, I think, a break of the deadlock. That will be the snap election.
Well, before that, I'm sure a lot of stories are still going on from now on. For now, I want to thank your expertise helping us to clarify what's going on right now with the Brexit process. Ian Begg, Larissa Brunner, and Cui Hongjian. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.